Hello, boys and girls. Today is Sunday, the day before New Year's Eve for 2019. Um, I've been working on a problem about whether England should leave the EU or not. What is the EU and the problems with the EU and why England should leave the EU. Right now, America is in deep trouble, Europe is in deep trouble, and the world is in deep trouble. And the European Union isn't helping any. It's actually a dictatorship, it's not democratic. England will be destroyed if it stays in there. All of its laws and rights and privileges will be overturned. The financial center in London will be destroyed. And if it tries to pull out, the banks in Japan and the United States and other countries will try to destroy the British pound. So right now, England has its own currency, unlike Greece and some other countries in the EU. Greece was forced to is being forced to sell off its assets to pay off a debt, and this debt was created when it was forced to buy military equipment for NATO, which it didn't need. And NATO was a creation of the Cold War and actually the Nazis who basically started the Cold War. And General Reinhard Gehlen was Hitler's master spy against the Soviets, in charge of interrogating, torturing, starving, and shooting 4 million Soviet POWs. It's called the Man Without a Face, the most dangerous man in Europe, and he lied about the Soviet military strength and lied about their intentions after World War II, and got us believing that they wanted to take over the world, which was a lie. Also, by in passing, this Nazi propaganda about the Rothschilds financing the war. World War II, Hitler was financed by the Krupp Steel Empire, which also financed Kaiser Wilhelm in World War One, and financed Bismarck in 1848, who stopped all the revolutions in Europe. Right now, NATO is full of neo-Nazis and neocons, and the U.S. Uh, want to start a war with Russia. The media is lying, and it wants to start a war with Russia. But we cannot win a conventional war with Russia, which is allied to China strategically. These are nuclear powers, and Eisenhower never wanted a conventional war with Russia or China. Didn't want any war with Russia or China, and to think that you can win a nuclear war with Russia and China is insane. So I'm calling it suicide, and this is the move that's going on right now. Uh, a posture of war is war, according to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, written in 1688 during the Civil War in England. You need a strong leader during times of civil war. We had Abraham Lincoln, but Lincoln was shot, and it was you would think, the Civil War should have ended the issue of slavery, but America still needs slave class. The ruling, I call it the ruling class, cannot live without a slave class, and they're using the illegals as the slave class. So there were 40 GOP votes in the House that would not vote for Trump's immigration plan, which would have solved the problems of the border because they didn't want to solve the immigration problem. They want illegals. So now we have a new so-called Democratic Congress coming in, but what are these guys but anti or Russia phobes? By the way, my name is Russo, which means Russia or red, but I'm not a member of the Communist Party. However, I am an honest philosopher and I'm a 100% loyal American. I do not want to see us go into war. We don't need a war. We didn't need any more wars after World War II. We didn't really need World War II, but Churchill got Roosevelt to enter the war. Churchill went to England, some ships, and then our convoys started getting sunk by German subs. So we went into the war. If you want to go to war with us, just sink one of our ships. And I think they were sinking 2 million tons of merchant marine ships off the East Coast here with their U-boats, who traveled in wolf packs of 30 and 40 subs at a time. For 2 years, the Germans sank our convoys until we finally got serious and ran them out of the Atlantic by putting destroyers, one on each corner of the convoy, one up front, and searchlight on a plane, a huge light that would fly at night to look for subs, and then if they found any, they would track them back to their pack and then sink the pack. These wolf packs were coming up at night at the time when we didn't have look down radar under the ships. I mean, yeah, we couldn't look directly down, so, or side to side, I think. In any case, they would come up and sit by the side at night of a ship and then just start sinking ships. So, meanwhile, the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany, which took 19,000 cities and towns, and killed 29 million or more people. It deported. There was a place called the Russian Pale where the Jews had lived for 300 or 400 years. There was this German general, Reinhard Gehlen, was in charge of foreign armies east, the so-called Russian front. He had all the information on the Soviet military. He kept it on microfilm, and he hid it in barrels and pastures in Austria, and later traded this for a job at the U.S. CIA with Allen Dulles, who was a crooked lawyer, and with his brother John Foster Dulles. Together, they laundered Hitler's stolen billions with the Bush family, the Thyssen private banks in Berlin, Rotterdam, and New York. George Bush Sr.'s grandfathers, George Herbert Walker and George Prescott Bush, were involved in this laundering. It's where the Bush family got their money. And George Bush Sr. was in the CIA in '61 in charge of the Bay of Pigs operation. He was director of CIA in '76. He was in the CIA Op 40 with Nixon after the Bay of Pigs, and the mission was to kill Kennedy and blame the murder on Castro to try to make us mad enough to kill Castro. They said Kennedy was too gutless to kill Castro. Nixon wanted to kill Castro from the time he took over in '59 till I guess Nixon died. But Castro was in power till he was 90 or almost 90. He turned his government over to his brother. He had nothing to do with Kennedy's death. It was a CIA operation. Kennedy had signed an order to pull out of Vietnam and dismantle the CIA. And when that order went out, the order went out to kill Kennedy in Dallas. The Chicago mob wanted him dead because his brother, Bobby, was deporting mobsters to Sicily. The Israelis wanted him dead because he tried to stop them from making nuclear weapons underground at Dimona. And the order really went out from Prime Minister David Ben Gurion to Mayor Lansky, who's a Jewish mobster in the Chicago mob, to Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, who constructed a Sicilian-style hit with Oswald as the fall guy. So Hoover helped frame Oswald. Said he was a communist. He actually, Oswald was eating lunch on the other side of the building, never left the building, had nothing to do with killing Kennedy. And basically 3 ex-Marine sharpshooters were sent to Dallas to pose as guards to kill Kennedy. So And one of them was an ex-cop, Richard Kane from Chicago, one of the two shooters in the window in the sixth floor depository. The first shot hit Kennedy in the neck, and Connolly looked around and he was holding his neck. The bullet went in the back, came out the front. The Bethesda doctors thought it was a trach hole. It was a bullet hole. And Connolly heard that rifle shot come from behind his right shoulder from the Texas School Depository. So I think Oswald had a double in the CIA who was in the window with Kane. And Kane had a German Mauser .765 caliber. Kennedy, no bullets were recovered from Kennedy's body, but the CIA at the time was racist. They had decided not to protect him because he was for civil rights. He wrote the 1964 Civil Rights Bill that Johnson passed. He wrote it in 63 after the Birmingham, Alabama riots when Martin Luther King was put in jail in the Birmingham jail, from which he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail. And Vietnam was a racist war, according to King. We actually had allied with Vietnam during World War II to get rid of the Japanese because Churchill said he would ally with the devil to get rid of the Japanese, since the devil was a communist. So what's all this got to do with present day? Well, the fact is we should have had peace after World War II. We have had nothing but war. We had the Korean War, fighting communism, supposedly. The U.S. Alan Dulles, the crooked lawyer who laundered Hitler's stolen billions, also hired 4,000 Nazis to work for the CIA in 1947 when Truman signed the bill. All Truman wanted was a summary of his daily intelligence. Instead, he got this agency full of Nazis, including General Reinhard Gehlen. And Gehlen had started this Operation Gladio in Europe, which was to kidnap and kill democratically elected leaders in Europe, especially to stop communist takeover of European countries. So President or Prime Minister Moro in Italy was killed by supposedly the Red Brigade, which was mythical. The Red Brigade was actually Nazis coming from the NATO spin-off armies under Reinhard Gehlen, who ran our West Berlin intelligence, our intelligence for NATO from West Berlin. Gehlen was alive during World War I with Hitler. Gehlen was in the German War Circle, which was a spy circle, which stayed in existence when it should have gone out of existence after the war. And they thought the army would come back to power. The U-boats actually thought that the army lost the war. They didn't lose World War I. But Mussolini, by the way, was a socialist who was in Italy, who fought communism, ironically, in Italy, and taught Hitler men how to fight communism or communists. And the Pope, Eugenio Pacelli, became the Pope, was a church lawyer. He wrote the treaty that started World War I that was ratified a few days before the war, World War I. World War I was basically a training ground for the Nazi officers for World War II. But Hitler came to power in 1933, had 5 elections that year until his party got a majority, and then they appointed him president. And he kept having elections till his party won, which is one reason I don't want to see another referendum in England over the EU. The EU is basically a collectivist organization. The only thing socialist about the Nazis, the National Socialists, was collectivism. They didn't American Self-Reliance essay by Emerson and Equality. The individual and his conscience, okay, and the way you're indoctrinated, even equality under the law and things like that. Especially the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the American system of government, the British system of government, the British system of government will be destroyed by the EU, which is systematically undoing the laws of the countries that it takes over. And it also is marching Europe with NATO into a war with Russia. It'll be a nuclear war, and they are allied with a nuclear China. So I'm calling it suicide. And I just, it's a long story. I guess it's a very long story because I was born in 52. We're talking about things that happened in the 30s and the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Well, I was alive in the 50s and 60s, but I didn't know when Kennedy was shot that the CIA was involved. I knew that the CIA was something wrong with it. I knew that if you got a job there, they would basically make you into a pauper before they would give you a task. They would make you into like an unknown and then send you somewhere at the bottom of the economic rung where nobody would pay attention to you. But what has happened is that Europe has become uniform and mediocre under the EU. And the EU is systematically robbing the European countries. And the people are letting this happen because they are being told that they have benefits in the EU because it's a trade bloc. You don't have to have a political organization. It's actually a political organization and an economic organization created by the US CIA to control Europe as a single entity. And Trump wants to deal with each country individually as far as the trade issues go. Actually, the Congress is supposed to control the trade, but Trump is using his expertise in making deals to get good trade deals pretty much single-handedly because Congress has kind of abdicated its powers. It's supposed to declare wars, but it hasn't declared a war since 1941. All these other so-called wars are really police actions. They're not formally declared. We never really declared Korea, the Korean War, Vietnam. Those were basically unconstitutional, illegal wars. And the War Powers Resolution Act that Congress passed in 1970 something to get out of Vietnam says the president can send troops in for 90 days before Congress has to declare war. Well, that gives him 90 days to start a war and then ask to support the troops. So the Ways and Means Commission committee is supposed to come up with the tax resolutions, but it's not doing that. Obama decided he was going to kill Americans without due process of law. He's got away with that. They're using NATO, which is 28 countries, to cover the war crimes. And so far, meanwhile, you've got the Israelis over here under deep cover, controlling Congress, and pretty much both parties. They gave Rubio $438,000. They've given money to Feinstein. They've given money to Schumer. Schumer is basically working for the Israelis, but the media is also under control of the Israeli Mossad. So they're not really correcting the lies. The people in D.C. thought they could invade Ukraine, which is divided into an eastern half, which wants to be in the EU, and the western half, which is Russian. which was Russified years ago. And those soldiers there do not want to kill their own people, so they're defecting. There's a civil war in the Ukraine between the neocons, the neo-Nazis, and the Russian citizens. Crimea used to be part of Russia. Russia did not invade Crimea, did not invade Ukraine. It does not intend to invade the Baltics. It doesn't want war. I'm 7 months older than Putin. I can guarantee you he doesn't know that Israelis are behind the Iraq war. They lied about Saddam Hussein. They said he was going to go nuclear, take all the oil in the Mideast. They want to get rid of Saddam and Iraq's big army, which was Sunni. So they did, and we helped them because they told us he was going to go nuclear and take all the oil. Well, that didn't happen, but we killed him, basically, and his sons. Um, the Israelis have been lying to us for years, and their lobbies, the biggest lobby in D.C., they have a Zionist lobby in D.C. Basically, their top spies here are making about $2,000 a day, coming out of Canada with perfectly forged passports. They're running drugs across the southwest border, cocaine and about or 14,000. He wants to bring half of them home. Ron Paul says he should bring them all home. That would save $50 billion he could use for the wall. The Democrats aren't going to give him this money. He's got the government shut down. Trump is making mistakes selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has been propping up the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia for years. The U.S., since World War II, has supported every fascist dictatorship on earth because it's anti-communist. And before the war, we were allied with the Nazis to take over the world's markets. Then they got greedy and wanted it all, so we split. But General Motors was making engines for the German tanks. One of their bombers' engines, the Ju-88, and if Hitler had had a four-engine bomber to reach the Ural Mountains, he could have destroyed the Russian factories that built the tanks and the planes that came back and took back 19,000 cities and towns and went into Berlin with 20,000 tanks. So we were just lucky there was a Soviet Union in World War II. So that goes back to World War One. The Russian army mutinied. There was a revolution, 1917. And then the Israelis and the KGB wanted to get rid of Gorbachev, and they didn't want friendly relations with the West because then we wouldn't need Israel as an ally anymore. So they helped get rid of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Now everybody's saying that Reagan and Bush Sr. did this. They had nothing to do with it. The CIA had nothing to do with it. And the CIA basically is the other side of the mob in this country. And it was running, I don't know if it still is running, crack cocaine into the ghettos. Maxine Walters says it got the blacks addicted to crack cocaine. Well, be that as it may. There was a guy who had evidence of that. I never got to see it. Michael Helmy, who died, was a production, call it a production engineer or something, a Hollywood production designer. Anyway, okay, so the U.S. doesn't owe 20 trillion or 21 trillion. The banks owe 552 trillion. They've spent all this money on these endless wars. This war in Iraq cost us trillions of dollars, blood and treasure that can't be replaced. And a lot of that money was spent off the books. This war in Afghanistan has never been declared. Trump needs to declare victory and bring the boys home. He just is supposed to pull out of Syria, but Putin is skeptical, and I heard the Air Force doesn't want to come out. there's just people here that make too much money on war. Wall Street is tied to the military spending. Trump has a $700 billion military budget. And Eisenhower said we didn't need a big military budget in peacetime. We're not legally at war. And so, but you have this drive to go to war. The media wants war. So there's this push right now. And all this crap by the Democrats about the Russians and stuff is baloney. I happen to know Cuba and Russia and every communist government on earth has nothing to do with getting involved in the foreign affairs of internal affairs of sovereign states. Putin and Russia had nothing to do with Hillary Clinton losing the election. By the way, as Trotsky said in his autobiography, people lose power, political power, for one reason only: they don't deserve to have it. Hillary and Bill were in the White House for 8 years. She tried to start some kind of a socialized medicine system, according to Bob Dole, who shut the Senate down to stop her. And then the Republicans took over the Senate and the House with Newt Gingrich, who got rid of all the treaties that Gorbachev and Reagan had signed to stop nuclear proliferation. So we are back where we were. It's worse now than it was before the 80s when we were getting ready for a nuclear war. We are now increasing our nuclear missiles. In Europe, Obama put anti-ballistic missiles in Poland. He put 4,000 troops. You have NATO in Russia's face, trying to expand into China. And basically, they are beating the drums to go to war. The neocons, the neo-Nazis, and John Bolton, by the way, was an idiot when he was in the UN. He's a liar. He's a neocon. He's dragging us into war. Trump has a bad habit of putting people like Nikki Haley in power who don't deserve power. Why would you put someone in power who ran against you when you were campaigning for the nomination? Why would you put your enemies in power? I mean, it's the worst thing he could have done. She didn't deserve to get the nomination. She didn't deserve to be president. Put her in head of our UN policy. She pulled us out of the Human Rights Council in the UN, and she doesn't want to criticize Israel. Israel is, the people may be okay. I hear there's a lot of them turning into alcoholics, but 98% of them are atheists. They're not really. Well, they stole the land from the Palestinians that they lived on for 2,000 years, and they're committing genocide against the Palestinians. And in Gaza, they have a blockade on Gaza, and Trump has sold weapons to the Saudis they're using to kill civilians with, bombing school buses. They're stopping medicines from coming into ports in Yemen that would cure the cholera. And there's people dying of cholera, and there's the 12 million people starving to death. That is a humanitarian crisis. Someone asked Judy Woodruff on public TV about, or someone, she asked some woman what the biggest crisis was. The woman was talking about Africa. Africa has an AIDS epidemic, and they say AIDS was created by the U.S. Biowarfare Engineering Department, which could be true, probably to get rid of homosexuals in the army, but there's an AIDS epidemic in China. The world is in bad shape. You have South America's in terrible shape, extremely terrible. You have China has repression of minorities and women that aren't minority. People are abysmally ignorant of what's going on in the world and in their own country. The so-called Cultural Revolution was a savage purge of intellectuals, a widespread book burning. The Chinese really don't know their own culture very well. The Russians are mostly, I guess Putin is Orthodox Christian. The CIA saying he's the devil. The U.S., by the way, needs a devil. We have to have some excuse to spend all this money on military equipment. There's no military equipment that's produced that isn't used in a war somewhere. So all this new equipment Trump is producing, they've got to have a war somewhere to blow it up. A Cold War or a hot war. A hot war, you blow it up right away. Cold War, you save it up to blow up in the hot war. So we had 50 years of Cold War. Now we're trying to have hot wars. Meanwhile, the Sunnis in Iraq were destroyed, so the Shia took over. The Kurds are a Shiite tribe related to the Iranian Shiite. The Yemeni Houthis are Shia, and Israel wants to destroy the Shia, so they want to destroy so they're, Saudi Arabia. Trump says Israel needs Saudi Arabia. Actually, he said America needs Saudi Arabia. Why do we need a dictatorship that's intent on killing genocide in Yemen? By the way, you think genocide's just a term, but we wiped out 90% of the Native American tribes here in North America since Christopher Columbus came. 90% of the native tribes here and in South America are gone. And you have China is going to Africa and trading infrastructure for mineral rights. So if you remember the game Risk, if you take over Africa, you can take over the world from Africa. So the Chinese, actually, this is one more thing. You have a vast shift of wealth and power from the U.S. and UK to China and the Orient. So you already have this shift going on. And then you have the EU, which is pretty much got Europe by the balls. And if England doesn't get out of the EU, it's going to destroy the British system of government and it will destroy their power. So the move is control from the United States, which can't really control its own borders, and it can't control, well, it sure can control the weather, but the U.S. is in deep debt, almost bankrupt, and I think 47 out of 50 states, or 47 out of the 48 lower at 48 states, are in the red. They can't even. The states are in trouble, so the United States is in trouble. And then you have these natural disasters, or you might as well call them, I don't know, mega disasters, because you've got possibility of the West Coast being destroyed by volcanoes or tsunamis or earthquakes, or all three. You've got the Yellowstone caldera that's ready to go. You've got the Long Valley caldera ready to erupt. You've got Mount Rainier ready to erupt. You've got the Helena slip in Hawaii on the south of the Big Island, that can fall in the ocean and slip in the ocean and create a 1,000-foot tsunami. You've got a mess. The whole western U.S. could be destroyed in natural disasters. And the U.S. isn't going to be able to do a damn thing about it. So that's the situation. Hi, Noddy.